Um, what we've heard yesterday and what we keep hearing in many discussions is really, of course, the war in Ukraine is a game changer for European integration, and I think that's undisputed. The question is really to what extent is it actually changing the game? How fast is it changing the game? And I think, for example, in terms of enlargement, we of course see there's been a push on the one hand for enlargement, but there are question marks to what extent the process can be fast-tracked, what that actually means for the Western Balkans. We see it also in terms of institutional reform. We see, okay, institutional reform of the EU is finally back on the agenda. We see a group of friends of QMV. We see a Franco-German group of experts debating institutional reform. But at the same time, we don't want to speak about treaty reform. And we still, of course, don't have any unanimity to change to QMV. And the third example is defense. Of course, we see a massive increase of defense spending in the member states. We see a lot of support to Ukraine, but at the same time, we don't necessarily see more integration, or we don't see more cooperation, rather the reverse, actually. And the feeling you get from this is really that European leaders are sitting a little bit on the fence. And so the question that we're trying to tackle today is, do we think they are ready to get off this fence? And if so, where are they actually going? And I'm very happy that, Nathalie, that you will kick us off today for many reasons, but also because you've just come from the informal General Affairs Council on exactly this topic, on the future of enlargement, on the future of institutional reform, and I'm sure you can fill us in on what's the state of the art and on whether they're actually coming off the fence. And that will be followed by comments from Stefan, from Valbona. Nathalie, you'll have 20 minutes, and you'll each have 5 to 7. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Nicole. So I'll end on enlargement, but before I get to enlargement, the general framing of how I've been thinking about this question. As probably all of you know, Jean Monnet once said that Europe would be the sum of the solutions of the crises it would face. And so the question to me was really, how has Europe fared in this crisis? And especially sort of thinking about this in the context of what has been happening over the last 15 years or so, where Europe has actually been essentially hopping from one crisis to the next, some more existential than others, but basically you can trace a line, you can trace a line, from the failure of the constitutional treaty in 2005 onto the Eurozone crisis in 2008, through to 2013, more or less, the so-called migration crisis, 2015, the Brexit referendum, 2016, and then obviously we have the pandemic, and then we have the war. And if you look at this succession of crises, I think that in some, Europe really did it really seemed like Europe had lost its way. So if you think of particularly the Eurozone crisis and the migration crisis, it had lost that Jean Monnet art of transforming crisis into an opportunity for integration. It barely scraped through the Eurozone crisis, just doing enough not to fall over the precipice, and the migration crisis actually did nothing at all. One could argue because it wasn't a crisis, but that would take us in a different direction. And then so there was, essentially there was a sense of Europe was changing its DNA. I mean, it had lost that spirit that was really the driver of integration for many decades. Then we get to the pandemic, which was a good crisis for European integration, because both if you look at it from the perspective of public health, and in particular vaccine procurement, and especially if you look at it through the lens of economic recovery, it used, quote unquote, that crisis to make a step forward in integration. Now, when we move on to the war, the question, of course, becomes a lot more complicated, because more so than any of these previous crises, which really did only impact on one, max 2 policy areas, the war has really impacted on many. And so it's far more difficult, well, firstly, because we're still in the middle of the war, and secondly, because it impacts, at the very least, on, well, there's a broad question of political unity. There's the question of the economy, energy, asylum, defense, enlargement. So it's very difficult to give a sort of black and white answer. We've done well, we've done badly in terms of that Jean Monnet standard, in a sense, to this crisis. But even if, you can't give that black and white answer, let me attempt to go through some of these areas. So I'll end with enlargement, but let me go through several of these other areas to basically sort of try and give a tentative, because as I said, we're still in the midst of it, judgment on where we are. So beginning with politics, in a sense, and the question of unity. Have we managed to stick together? And actually, I think that when it comes to unity, so far, almost top marks. Now, the fact that there was unity at the beginning is, frankly speaking, hardly surprising, in the sense that this was such a shock that, it would have been a little bit odd had there not been unity in the face of such an obscenity, basically, that was happening. But I remember distinctly, and probably many of you do, what the debate was like in the summer of last year. Do you remember when, I think it was ECFR that published its poll, and sort of, there was this story of there's a division between the peace and the justice camp, or perhaps the compromise and the just peace camp. But anyway, and there was the sense of, there is war fatigue in some quarters of Europe, and this is ultimately gonna, these differences will gradually sort of crystallize into divisions, and it's gonna eventually paralyze the EU. And here we are, 1 year on from then, and it hasn't happened. And in fact, we have even learned, it's true that if you take agreement on sanctions as a parameter, in a sense, clearly the time lag from one package to the next has increased. But the more you sanction, the less there is to sanction, and inevitably the harder the negotiations become, because now we're obviously into the midst. I was actually surprised that we even got to an agreement on the 11th package. But once you start bringing third states in, and therefore China in, it gets even more complicated. And yet, that unity has actually held. And I think actually that's rather remarkable. And, we've even managed to, in a sense, contain the, sort of problem, micro problem number one, which is obviously Orban. So unity, I would say, actually far better than the expectations. Now, the reason why I think that unity has held is because, and here I get onto the second and third theme, because the economy has held up. And this is essentially because we faced the energy crisis really remarkably well. And again, if we go back to what the debate was like a year ago, no one would have imagined that we would be where we are today. And, I remember sort of conversations with, energy, not only experts, but people in the sector that would, well, firstly, they ruled out the fact that there would ever be Russia turning off the taps. And if you press them, you say, well, okay, for the sake of argument, what happens if it does? Well, catastrophe of catastrophes, we're entering into war economy. This is going to plunge us into the deepest economic recession ever. And none of this has happened. None of this has happened. Again, only a year later, we're basically at gas prices that were, basically in September, when the energy crisis predates, and let's always remember this, the energy crisis predates the war. So we're back at those price levels, which are still high and they're still a problem, but they're not the consequence of the war. And the reason why all this has happened is partly, obviously, sheer luck, okay, the usual two exogenous explanations, i.e. climate and China. Climate being warm and China messing up so badly. And even now, its economic recovery not really taking off, which still means that there's a certain I mean, the supply markets are not as tight as what many had expected, especially, obviously, LNG markets. So, yes, indeed, there are those exogenous factors, but, and going back to Monet, the EU, and again, let's bear in mind that energy is, at the very least, a mixed competence, and energy mixes are exclusive competences of member states, but the EU actually did, a little bit like with the pandemic, did actually carve out new competences out of this crisis. It did coordinate storage levels. It did coordinate the reduction of consumption, both of gas and of electricity. It has, using the example, although it's a totally different market, but using the example of vaccines, it has developed a joint platform for the procurement of gas. Yes, indeed, it's only for 15% of that gas. I was having this conversation actually a couple of nights ago with Sefcovic that has been in charge of this. But this has been going far beyond what his expectations were. On a number of issues, essentially that step forward integration has been made, and it has happened rather than by setting to one side the energy transition agenda, actually by accelerating it further. Yes, it's true that at the moment we're in the beginning of, in a sense, a green lash against the EU's climate agenda, but you could also actually say, well, frankly speaking, in terms of what the Fit for 55 agenda was, most of it has been done. And it hasn't been slowed down. In fact, in many respects, it has been accelerated as a consequence of the war. So I think, economy and therefore energy, again, sort of fairly good marks. Then we start getting into the more problematic areas. And here let me touch on, defense and then enlargement. On defense, this is almost a tragic story. Because, people like myself and you, Nicole, sort of working on defense for a long time, some of the things that have happened over the last year and a half are actually, by EU standards, revolutionary. And yet, it's what you were saying. And yet, has this brought us any closer towards my beloved strategic autonomy? No, we're further away from that goal. And why is this the case? So although, yes, increase in defense spending, yes, the European Peace Facility, yes, the European Peace Facility, not quote unquote just to channel military assistance to a third state at war, but also to become, the ammunition story, to become a, in a sense, first platform for joint procurement of weapons. Yes, now it's the case of ammunition, but once you get the mechanism up and running, in principle, you could use it for other military capacities as well. So truly revolutionary stuff. And yet, why are we further away from that goal? Well, because we're doing all this during a war, not during peace. Had we done all this in peacetime, it would have been, that greater military spending would have gone into the development of European capacities. I mean, what's behind the Franco-German rift over air at the moment? It's precisely this, right? Had this happened during peacetime, probably Germany would not have gone the route that it has. It's happening in wartime. You've got to do things as quickly as possible. The threat is now, and so what you do is you buy American. And so that brings you further away from that goal of autonomy. And is this good for Europe? No, it's bad for Europe. I would argue it's bad for the transatlantic relationship as well, but that, again, would take us in a different direction. But I say, as I said, it's a tragic story because you can't really criticize the EU for not having, for not doing things. I mean, as I said, they're doing things and they're doing fairly revolutionary things, but simply the context is such that that remains kind of woefully insufficient. And then finally, enlargement. And, you know, sort of we've been talking about this, you've been talking about this yesterday as well. Yes, I mean, enlargement really is back in a way in which it wasn't, I would say, essentially between Croatia aside, but between 2007 and last year. And I think it wasn't because basically there was a sense of we, the EU, but in a sense, the candidate countries, again, we could live without enlargement. And yes, you know, it won't be necessarily a wonderful world of peace, love, happiness, security, prosperity, and democracy, but, you know, more or less stable. And plus we, the EU, we've got plenty of things to think about, exactly, Eurozone crisis, migration, and all the rest of it. Basically, why is enlargement back? And I think epitomizing this is really the turn of the terms of the debate in France, because we've realized there is a cost to non-enlargement, and that cost is potentially massive. I mean, it's potentially a war, right? And that is basically what has all of a sudden shifted the debate from one in which, you know, yes, you know, the policy goes on, the institutions go on, institutions never die by definition, to all of a sudden a real political discussion about, okay, fine, what is it that actually needs to happen? And so to conclude on this, simply to conclude on the other evening, I was actually quite struck how there is, firstly, there is no opposition to this. No opposition from any member state, which is, I think, really quite remarkable in itself. Nor is there implicit opposition. Hey, but what about reforms? And not that they, obviously, as in reforms in candidate countries. You know, there's not a passing of the buck in a sense, just to focus attention on what candidate countries need to do. There is the beginning of a discussion which is very much about what is it that we need to do to be ready for this. Now, in all honesty, it's still at the very beginning of this discussion. But at the very least, I think that the right questions are being asked. There is, you know, the questions in terms of what is absolutely necessary and what's nice to have. What is urgent, as in what needs to happen by tomorrow morning if one candidate country needs to enter, and what doesn't. Which are the issues, you know, sort of dividing things up, you know, sort of categories of reform questions that basically kind of span from questions of representation, question of decision-making, questions of policy, where I would argue it's that latter category which is the most complicated one. We're still very far, I would say, from even beginning to actually think through and having consensus solutions. But as I said, I think it's very encouraging how under now the Swedish presidency, I'm very confident this is going to carry on with the Spanish presidency. There is a political sense that these questions need to be addressed now. And if by the end of the year, we at least have an agreed shopping list of agenda items that they need to tackle, that's already a big step forward in terms of, as I said, where we were last year. I think this consensus has only actually crystallized over the last few months. I think when enlargement started, came back last year with the candidacy of Ukraine and Moldova, I think it was basically an emotional solidarity. We've got to do something. We can't not do it. I think now the conversation is starting to get more strategic, which is, I think, the necessary place to start, basically, to start addressing the questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nathalie. You were even shorter than the time, so you have more time to respond later. But thanks very much for this very differentiated Monet test that you put to the current situation. And if I just can summarize very briefly, you're giving top marks to European unity, to the economy, tragic story and energy, the tragic story for defense and. Yeah. It's usually even more tragic then. and then, but actually ending on quite a hopeful outlook on enlargement. And I would like to pass now to Stefan to see if he shares the same assessment of the Monet test.
Thank you. Thanks, Nathalie, for a wonderful presentation. It's good that you started with the Monet quote. Europe will be forged in crisis and will be the sum of solutions found in crisis. I spent the last 2 months teaching a course on this quote, basically. Because the funny thing is, the irony is, he published this in 1974. And if you look at the early history of the EU, it's totally wrong, completely wrong. I think the drivers of integration was the economic logic, it was the spillovers effect from one step to the others. There are plenty of crises, but very few that had this kind of galvanizing effect. Right? Somebody explained to me that Jean Monnet was a bit of a drama queen, because he was an official, right? He had never had political function, but he needed to motivate politicians to carry out his plan. And his way of doing this is create a sense of crisis, so that there was actually a motivation to do something. But now we applied this Monet test to the 8 crises, big crises that hit the EU since 2009. And we gave them marks, right? And the Eurozone crisis, we gave them a positive mark, because altogether... yes. Because altogether, what the changes in the financial architecture were very far-reaching. The ECB, in ways nobody had anticipated before. Altogether, this was an enormous step forward in terms of the consolidation of the monetary union. And even though this is incomplete, it's not finished business, it was a huge step forward, and the euro has become more resilient as a result. We saw the migration crisis. Monet totally, because it created massive divisions. It created no significant deepening of European integration. It led to the rising up of populist, rightist, anti-EU forces that are active till today. And even this deal on asylum reached last week is a fake deal which will not work in practice at all. So clear negative. Brexit, it was a mixed result, because on the one hand, we lost a hugely important partner, particularly in foreign policy, also a big net payer into the budget. On the other hand, we would never have the reconstruction fund. We probably wouldn't have had the common vaccination program with the UK there. So I think it's open, it's sort of a mixed balance. With the rule of law crisis, also I see a mix, basically, because on the one hand, you have very considerable deepening. This conditionality mechanism gives the Commission much greater leverage in dealing with rule of law deficits in the member states. But on the other hand, you have massive loss of trust, massive divisions and blockages now all over the place. So again, mixed. I think climate is a very, very clear positive, because the Fit for 55 package is probably the most ambitious thing that the EU has ever undertaken. It's not integration, it's transformation. It's much more important ultimately, and it also leads to massive new powers for the EU institutions, because all these 50 pieces of legislation have elements of control and monitoring, etc., new role for the Commission and for the EU as such. Pandemic, also a clear positive. I think after the initial shock with a very sort of nation-first approach, there was unity, the vaccination program, reconstruction, the health union, big steps forward. On energy, I'm not so sure. For me, it's sort of mixed, because you're right, altogether this passed better than many had expected, but I don't see any real deepening. I think the steps that were reached, the common purchasing, the coordination of the storage facilities, these are gimmicks. Basically, they are not very real, and there have been very big and far-reaching fights, basically fights about the cap. Finally, we have a cap, which is a total joke. About the linking of electricity and energy prices. Again, big divisions without any outcome. About the funding, you have the 200 billion big bazooka of Germany, which led to massive resentments in the south because they can't compete with Germany in this regard. So I don't see any real deepening in that sense. On the Russian aggression, I had clearly, for all the reasons that you outlined, it's clearly positive, our assessment. Now, we then analyzed, and I found that much more interesting actually, what are the big factors that make one crisis a positive factor for the development of the EU, and what makes it a negative factor? And I came up with 4 big factors in this regard. One very obvious one is symmetry, asymmetry, right? It's very clear that the EU deals much better with crises that hit everyone pretty much in the same way than a crisis that, like the migration crisis, where you have the frontline states, you have the countries of destination, massively divergent interests that are not even ideological or anything, but in the nature of the thing, right? So the second big factor is that sort of the value added of action on the EU level, because obviously, if a crisis hits, the first instinct is of member states to deal with it with their own resources, and that's very good, basically. The difficulty is that finally, a few months, finally realize they can't do it by themselves, and sometimes they sort of pass dependence, and it takes them much too long to actually get it and move towards the European level for common action. The third one is political leadership. I think throughout most of the crisis of the last 14 years was basically Angela Merkel in the the Queen of the European Council was absolutely crucial. Since her departure, it's sort of a mix, but sometimes it is the Commission basically that has assumed the role. Sometimes there is sort of still a remnant of the German-French leadership, but it's less clear and much more difficult to define than before. And the final criteria, big factor, is mutual trust. Also trust in the European integration. And there, I think, it depends very much on whether you build a record of achievement that creates more confidence that the next crisis can also be faced on the level of European institutions. But this building up is very hard and difficult, and losing it is very quick. Right? So I think we managed, we were probably more coherent on Russia because we managed the pandemic extremely well. So I think this builds up, and at the moment I think the EU overall is in better shape than it was in 2009, because overall the record has been positive. Now, these 4 criteria, applying it to the Russian challenge. Symmetry, asymmetry, I think fundamentally is symmetrical, right? Because this is such a massive fundamental breach of basic principles, and it's a threat against everyone. But there are asymmetries, right? Obviously, it's latent, it's not out in the open, but there is still something of a peace camp, including, unfortunately, also my own country. And there is a victory camp that sees no other solution. And I think there is a big risk that this divide will at one point come into the open, maybe if the US elections go wrong or something else happens. The second point, value added, is a very clear case. Nobody wants to do sanctions on an individual basis. They only make sense if they are done collectively. Also, support for Ukraine is something that you can do much better if you really bring common efforts together and coordinate it in an effective way. Political leadership, I would think, in this case, we've outsourced it to the United States of America. I think Josep Borrell said, I think, on some issues like candidate status for Ukraine, but overall, I think there is no question about that the US leadership on this issue was absolutely decisive also for European unity on this point. I think Borrell said this is the birth of the geopolitical Europe, but in a way it's the rebirth of the benevolent US hegemony. And that is a big problem in the medium term because it might not be there. But we absolutely depend on it, and this has come out very, very clear. And on mutual trust, it's there, I think, for the time being. The record of achievement is quite positive, but it is very much related to the collateral damage on the EU, and that was much milder than we had anticipated. But if it would have or if it becomes again much tougher, I would not totally be sure that this kind of confidence in the EU's capability of managing this crisis can be maintained at that level. Thank you. That was too long.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Also for having a slightly different perspective of the Monet test, diverging a little bit on the energy issue. Perhaps Nathalie can comment later whether maybe it's related also to the factors you threw in, symmetry, asymmetry. But before we'll hear Valbona, and very interested to hear whether you have a similarly positive assessment of enlargement as Nathalie.
Well, thank you very much. First, I'd like to thank Nathalie not just for her research, but also for being, I think, one of the voices in the European Union when it comes to those issues. Writing and all that, so kudos to you. You know, as I was listening to Nathalie, I started writing down some points, and I think very much in line with what you said. I think the words Ukraine, I think shattered the European security architecture. That if we look at that from the minimalistic perspective, it was based on a three-legged stool, which was from the security perspective, relying on the United States and NATO for its security. And Nathalie talked about that when she talked about, the strategic autonomy. I think all these ideas that we have been talking 2 years ago, European army and things like that, nobody even mentions those anymore. So, but also when it comes to defense budgets and all that, we're seeing, an increase across the board in the European Union. It's an interesting fact because, the war is in European territory. An interesting fact is that when it comes to NATO budgets, the NATO budgets were closest to parity when it comes to European NATO members and the United States just during the Balkan Wars. It was only those 2-3 years where the United States paid 55% and the Europeans 40%. That was the only time in NATO when that was closest to parity. The conflict was in Europe. The second point relates to what Nathalie talked about regarding energy. And I think, she described that from, the unity perspective and measures that were taken in the European Union. I would look at that also from the, geopolitical perspective is that this strong stool there in the European architecture was that reliance on Russian cheap gas. And so, the European Union and member states had to quickly come out of that. And we saw that that was successful. It could be done. But then there's a third point in this stool that we're not talking about, which is cheap markets and products, or big markets and cheap products from China. And that is something that, we need to discuss more in the future when it comes to Europe as a geopolitical actor. And actually it was, von der Leyen that was the first one when she arrived that said that this is going to be a geopolitical commission. So I think this is, what has changed in Europe since the war in Ukraine. When it comes to enlargement, it's really good that enlargement is back in the conversation. There is this unity in the European Union. And Nathalie talked about, the cost of enlargement. And Zora and I had written a piece 3 years ago, something like that, that ended the piece that really, it's a cost-benefit analysis at the end of the day. The cost of not, and we were talking about the Western Balkans at that time, we're not including, we're not talking so much focused on Ukraine and the other countries. So if I look at an analysis and look at enlargement and how is that going to affect the European Union, there are some questions that come to my mind. The first one is the absorptive capacities of the European Union. when the European Union was already fatigued and looked at the Western Balkans, which at the end of the day, it's a market of 18 million, and wanted to reform more before getting these countries into the European Union. What is going to happen if we're talking about a second Big Bang enlargement for the EU? So the question of reforms in the European Union comes back in absorptive capacities. The second thing, and it was discussed this morning in the case of Ukraine also, is that we see a big difference now between the Eastern Partnership countries, the three, Moldova, Ukraine, and then in the future Georgia, and the Western Balkans when it comes to public perceptions on enlargement. On these three countries is at around 85–90% for enlargement. In the Western Balkans, it's 60% on average. But actually, what is even more challenging is that when people in the Western Balkans are asked, when do you think your country will become an EU member, it is 29% that say never. And that it moves from 41% in Serbia to 8% only in Kosovo that, think of enlargement like that. So that is the second question of, fatigue on one side in the European Union, but also reform fatigue and fatigue in the countries that are in the process of continuing the enlargement. And then the third one, and here I'll focus more on the Western Balkans, is the security dimension. I think, in the enlargement process, what the EU had lost, becoming, I like that, the technical close of the political process that you coined, I think had lost, it's like the security, the political security dimension, the importance of enlargement for the Western Balkans. And so what we're seeing nowadays, it's like not only slowing down, but actually we're talking about crisis management now. I mean, listening Borrell talk about crisis management in 2023, I think we're far away from, what we wished for the Western Balkans. I'm talking about relations between Serbia and Kosovo. So yeah, so these are the 2 points: security dimension in the Western Balkans, but also it looks like, the element of crisis management is coming back to the Balkans, which is not good news. And that's why we need to speed up the process of getting those countries closer to the EU. And I'll stop here. But thank you for your talk.
Thank you very much. Also for bringing in this element, a little bit more critical element of a changing narrative of crisis management rather than enlargement in the Western Balkans. I'll just open up the floor now. I already saw there were a few raised hands. We'll start with Ivana, and then, I'm sorry, and then Christoph, Piotr, and Peter.
Thanks so much. I loved this, good and bad things, and I especially like that you've been so honest saying, that defense is a tragic story. So I want to ask you, concerning that you're into the room, well, okay, you're closer than some of us, so I think it's important concerning the subject and the moment we're witnessing. So what are the worst case scenarios that are on the table at the moment concerning the implications of Russia-Ukrainian war, especially on dimensions of our defense and our security and enlargement? Because what's going on in Serbia at the moment is symptomatic from one side, and the other dimension of defense that you worked a lot on, especially concerning all the things that you do, it's digital resilience and cyber defense.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting insights. Nathalie, I wanted to ask about the arms procurement. Because in a sense, because it's the urgency of the situation, as you mentioned it, it seems that both sides, both France and Germany are right. I mean, their arguments are very valid, but then we are all entering, or we must enter a long, like middle to long-term mode when it comes to Ukraine war and its implications. So that means arms procurement also, this needs to be seen from the perspective of what you do not now in the next 6 months, but 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now. Not buying from the shelf necessarily because you need to use it now, but, or you need to store it now, whatever, but how to plan. And I wanted to ask you, I mean, when that comes into the equation and the thinking of the policymakers, where do you see the balance between France and Germany? To what extent Germany is ready to accept, but also act upon, if they accept the arguments of France? And also, I haven't heard anything about other EU member states that are, and also we can discuss what will happen if Trump comes to power, blah, blah, you know, all these things obviously will strengthen even more the French side of the argument. Yeah, but then I haven't heard anything about those countries that are actually, no matter what, not happy with the idea, like Poland and others. And they are also spending a lot of money on defense, but I don't think they are very much ready to entertain the thought that this will go European. So, a bit your thoughts on this.
Thanks for a very interesting presentation, Nathalie. I have two questions. First, you gave good grades on energy. Now, I just wonder, do you think that this is essentially more or less resolved, or could that still turn sour in the coming winter or in one of the following ones? And the second, on enlargement. I think initially there was some pressure through Ukraine's application to react, and I think key member states were rather lukewarm at the beginning or pushed, and I think indeed we have a shift here. We have an increasing realization that this is also in the EU's interest and there is a real necessity for it. But still, both Germany and in particular France say we need enlargement, but we also need internal reform. And my question is, how big do you think is the risk that they will not be capable of squaring this circle? At that, you know, I mean, internal reform is notoriously difficult, as we all know, and if it happens, it takes a long time, and there's absolutely no guarantee that it's happening at all. So how big is the risk that enlargement sort of becomes some collateral damage, and that we will have a declarative revival of the process, but not a factual one? Thank you.
Piotr?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation, Nathalie, and your comments, Stefan and Valbona. And I have one comment and one question, because what I kind of missed in your presentation, Nathalie, was one aspect, one implication of the war for the European Union, which I think is, to me, very important, perhaps more on the meta level, but also with very important consequences for policies. And this is the changing attitude to the idea of interdependence. And that basically that EU is turning under the influence of the war, under impression of the war and its general context, it's turning into this very much defensive mode, as opposed perhaps to this transformative agenda which the European Union used to have in the past. Towards the outside world. And I think this economic security strategy put forward by the Commission just the day before yesterday is perhaps the best example of it. And I think this is something which will drive the integration process in the upcoming years in many other policy areas, not just economy, although this is the most important factor. So this is a comment, and maybe you have further thoughts about it. But then I have a question to you, and probably also to Stefan, because he worked on that a lot and certainly has a very structured answer. Namely, how, because you identified certain institutional changes happening in the European Union over the last months as a consequence of the war. But I wonder how you would sum them up. So is it on the axis between, for example, community method and intergovernmentalism? Is it, or to put it differently, is it about centralization? Is it of the EU integration process or of the EU? Is it federalization? Is it rather strengthening of the Commission or maybe of Council? How to, what is your view of this institutional shift or in the balance of power within the European Union? Because my opinion is, or my impression is that both intergovernmental and community-oriented aspects of integration have been equally strengthened, almost. But maybe you disagree, or maybe you have a completely different assessment. Thank you.
Peter?
Thanks, Nathalie, for the fascinating insights and also for the comments. And I would just raise a question on one point on security. There seemed to be more or less a consensus between you, Nathalie, and Stefan and Valbona over that the general feeling in European Union after Russian invasion is that the transatlantic cooperation in security is a necessity, and that European army is off the table and so on. And my question would be that, is it? I can just recall Emmanuel Macron's infamous interview, cosmetics interview in Politico, where he told, and it was a softer version of the original one, as Politico shared that first of all, NATO, I mean, he was slightly critical of NATO, or rather harshly critical. He also raised again the typical points on strategic autonomy. He told that Taiwan is not our problem, and we should not let pro-American countries just set the tone in foreign policy and security policy. And of course, it can be read just political statements. We had the European Minister of France the week after in Budapest, and she had something quite different tone in all these issues. So it's maybe more hot air than serious substance, but based on this interview, it seemed that from France, this idea of strategic autonomy have not disappeared, and also it still impacts strategic thinking on security issues.
Maybe you can have 2-3 more questions from the side. It's you two and in the back.
Thank you. 2 questions, one on enlargement and one on European integration more widely. On enlargement, even though we're at the very beginning of the process, and you said, Nathalie, that at least it's unequivocal, the support for it, we still need to work out how the process will accommodate Ukraine. And so do you have a sense where the focus might be? Will it be on phasing in? And is there a risk that the focus might be on deeper integration with the candidate states, short of actual membership at the very end? So is there still that space for maneuver where we might integrate more profoundly, but not necessarily, commit seriously to membership? And then the second question on European integration, the reproach that's often made to the EU is that it's not more ambitious and that it's still missing from the wider global geopolitical competition. In your assessment, my understanding was that you thought just keeping it together and achieving a number of results is actually quite satisfactory for what the European Union is. Do you have a sense that there is going to be, especially since we're looking at the next strategic agenda, is there going to be a level of ambition that's going to go beyond what you have described? Do you feel that there's any political will, and is it feasible that the EU will engage more in this geopolitical competition, or the impact of the Russo-Ukrainian war is simply that, you know, we make some changes, but that doesn't alter the fundamental identity of what the EU is. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I really loved the assessment of the crisis that the European Union underwent throughout these last 10, 15 years. What the question goes to the three of you, and I would love to hear more about, I got the sense that your assessment took into consideration how the European Union and its member states underwent through this crisis. And having in mind that even the war crisis and the migration one and others are crises that are cross-border, are crises that are implying not just European Union and its members, but also European Union's partners, Moldova and Ukraine now, and Georgia and the south of the Mediterranean. I would love to hear more about if those grades that you've assigned to the way European Union underwent this crisis, are they going to be pondered down if you're taking into consideration the way the European Union treated, let's put it bluntly, its partners? And the subsequent question would be, is enlargement going to solve this problem? Thank you.
In the back.
Thank you. My question is whether is it possible that this unity that we are talking about is in fact the outcome. It's only possible because the standards for success are so low. The measure of success is usually you have a plan, a blueprint that leads you to an end goal. If you've achieved that end goal because you got lucky, winter was mild, and Ukrainians are fighting to the death with mostly US support, I think I'm wondering what is it in the EU plan for success that got us here, and it wasn't just Ukraine with US help.
Final question from Wojciech.
Thanks, fascinating, and also the questions are fascinating, I think. I have 2 points that I wanted to make also questions to your challenge. On one, I think on this speed of unity, of how quickly Europeans came about and unity on the Ukrainian response, one cannot miss the fact of strategic communication that US provided in a background diplomacy that allowed for this unity, both in terms of sharing intelligence that we have seen on unprecedented level, and also the very fact that Biden's administration is truly transatlantic and has this mindset that enabled Europe to be united. Otherwise, it would not. The second point on strategic autonomy, which is also a fascinating subject for myself, the two leaders that openly speak about this next to Macron, and usually they speak about it right after there were Western leaders visiting them, are Xi Jinping and Putin. They're actually lamenting as well about Europe not being strategically autonomous because, by definition, and sometimes they speak on the record also, adding this second part of a sentence, Europe is not strategically autonomous from US, as it was supposed to be, they say. Now, I think we have a fundamental problem with the concept that initially was not so contagious, but now it has become, and the only way to go about it there are 2 ways. One is tried, and there's an effort not to speak strategic autonomy, but think strategic autonomy while carrying out the projects that contribute to it. But I think that's not enough from the point of view of strategic communication also. Or to actually act on principle in a strategically autonomous way, taking decisions, evaluating our situation. And our situation in the next 18 months as Europe is that Trump may be coming back indeed. We need to take this consideration very seriously, and if we do, we need to ask ourselves, what can we do now as European countries within the next 18 months? And my argument would be here, I wonder what you think about it, is next to, of course, investing in our long-term strategic autonomy capabilities, capacity to act. Our capacity to act today is to increase purchases of arms from the US, to embed US, no matter who is in power for the next term, in a relationship with Europe, to be able to actually deliver on the war effort in Ukraine. If the Trump is the next president, then Europe has the capacity to act, to deliver the arms that would be procured and delivered within the capacity US may provide. Or it is a situation in which it's Biden and we just helped the right guy win the next elections.
Thank you. I'll hand it back to you. You have 10 minutes.
I hope I've got everything. Perhaps I'll be a little bit confused because I mean it would anyway. Many themes are obviously connected to one another. In fact, some questions answer each other in some respects, because I think Ivana, Wojciech's question, or rather premise, is the answer to your question. I mean, it's very clear, but I would put it actually in even more dramatic terms. Because you asked, what is the worst case scenario here? Well, obviously the worst case scenario is in a year and a half Trump. But the point is that even if that worst case scenario is averted, so even if we don't have a year and a half, we have 5 years and a half. I don't know how many of you came across Obama's interview with Christiana Amanpour. The best that can happen after Biden is Biden, but after Biden, even if you get not a Republican, but you get a Democrat president, he's going to be much closer to Obama than Biden. I mean, basically, Atlanticists in the US are a race. I mean, they're on the way to extinction. No. That isn't. I mean, I think across the board there is a sense of we had overestimated Russia's strength, and Russia actually doesn't represent the threat that we thought it did. I mean, of course, then there's still the nuclear question out there, but I think even that has diminished somewhat. There's more of a sense that it's part of a political strategy rather than a military one. So no, I don't think that is part of it. The horror scenario really does have to do with the US. Which then brings me to the question, the various questions which really have to do with security and defense. So it's not just France and Germany, if you think of it, it was in the ammunition debate. The problem was not France and Germany. The problem was Poland and France. And there too, both had a point. Yeah, because it is true that, if you are buying ammunition to help Ukraine, well, you need ammunition as quickly as possible, and so you buy American ammunition. But if you are also building this platform, if you're using this mechanism as a European joint procurement platform in the making, well, surely the aim is to buy European, build those capacities. So both were right. So how do you square that circle? Is it possible to square the circle? Yes, spending a lot more money. Now, I mean, it is possible because you need to spend both on the here and now, and that means buying American, and spending on building the capacities of tomorrow. Nowhere near where we are in terms of the debate, including in countries that have already made the 2%, aim to go beyond. I mean, we're talking about doubling that, basically, across the board. And is it possible to do in a year and a half? Well, we haven't even started talking about it, so I would say out of question. So the real question, if we get lucky and we get 5 years and a half, is it possible to do it in 5 years and a half? I'm not so sure. So it doesn't look pretty, frankly speaking. It really doesn't. Now, how does this, the relationship between strategic autonomy, what does, sort of the France point, etc., how does this then connect with NATO? So I think strategic autonomy as it was originally, what was really meant by it was Europeans kind of getting their act together. And then we can call it whatever we want, but that's really what it means. And actually, there was never really a disagreement. When it was framed in those terms, there was never really a disagreement. I mean, in 2016, this was not a controversial point. It became controversial when Macron adopted it. And especially because he did so the month in which Biden got elected. That's what made it toxic and kind of juxtaposed strategic autonomy with the United States. So that was the problem. So anyway, here we are today. What does this mean? And we're in a Europe where obviously NATO represents the kind of be-all and end-all of European security and defense. What does Europeans getting their act together more on defense mean today, as opposed to, several years ago? I actually think it means, and actually Macron said it, a European pillar in NATO. That's what it means. And this is basically what, and it's, it does. This is what caters for eventually an Obama-like president coming in that positive, hyper-positive scenario that after Biden, you get a Democrat, yeah. But that's what it means to basically not so much keep the US in, which obviously I totally agree we need to do, but ensure that there is that greater European responsibility for European defense within NATO. The European pillar within NATO was always something extremely fluffy. And I think now we kind of understand more what it means. And I think it is useful if the European Peace Facility, if the things that we're doing, both on the capacity side and on the operational side, can then be plugged into a European pillar in NATO, I think that's good news for everyone. Incidentally, I actually also think it's very good news for the United States. Because, to be honest, when, once upon a time, US global hegemon, it could kind of afford to have useless allies. That, it'd be convenient for them to, follow in kind of various adventures around the world, even if we thought it was a terrible idea, we didn't really have a choice, and so we just followed. But, if you're not the global hegemon anymore, it's actually quite nice to have strong allies rather than weak ones, So I actually think that, and incidentally, we don't talk about strategic autonomy that much anymore, but the US, they call it Europe's strategic responsibility, but you have Americans that increasingly talk about it. So surely there is some merit to the idea, regardless of the specific words that are used. On energy, why I actually, Stefan, think, and to the question, could it still go sour? It could still go sour, but it has nothing to do with the war, nor with Russia. So actually, if the nexus between the energy crisis and the war, I think, is over. Why can energy still be, and I think it will, 100% be a problem area? An area characterized by very acute volatility because the energy transition is happening. And the energy transition has, it's kind of, it's a transition, it's more like a revolution, yeah? And so volatility shocks are inherent in the transition. The point is, as we move along, why I say I'm optimistic, as we move along, crisis after crisis, energy crisis after energy crisis, due to this context that is going to be with us for the next decades, are we overcoming each one quickly enough in order to, and this is why I have a different assessment from you to the Eurozone crisis. The Eurozone crisis, it lasted 2008 to 2012. that is, I would say 13. That is 5 years. That's a long time. That means recession. If you overcome a crisis like the pandemic in a year, or like the energy crisis in a year, that's what prevents you from dipping into a recession. And we did. Okay, fine, you know, we were lucky, but we did some things. Yes, many of these things were done at national level, but then going back to Monet, what's the connection, if you think of it, of crises and Monet, in a sense, old interpretation, functionalism interpretation of the Monet method? That, and it goes to your values point, you can't resolve a crisis at national level, or rather the bits of a crisis that you can't resolve at national level, you pump, you know, sort of bring up to the supranational. And this is what was done with the energy crisis. Not only, because I think the acceleration of the legislative agenda on the Green Deal, you know, so it wasn't only that. And, you know, I think it's still very early days to see, you know, the joint procurement platform. It will never be particularly useful for a country like Italy or Germany. The point is, can it be useful for Slovakia? Can it be useful for small member states that don't have? It's a little bit like with the vaccines, right? You know, and so to the extent that it can be partly useful to address the future crises that will come, that will not be Russia-related, you know, I think that's good news. So, enlargement. How am I doing? Oh, shit. Okay. Enlargement. What did I write here? Okay. Okay, yeah, the reform point. The reform point and in a sense, the deepening, widening point. You know, I think that this, at the very least, is a moment, and this was part of the conversation a couple of nights ago. I mean, to call the bluff, right? It was a bluff to say, oh, it's deepening or widening, because the truth is that when we didn't widen, we didn't deepen either, and so there's evidence, yeah. I mean, there's empirical proof that basically you either deepen and widen, or you do neither of the two, right? So I think in terms of the reform questions, I mean, it's actually not as difficult as it looks, yeah? Because the only real thing that you need to figure out, like immediately, is, you know, the question of how many commissioners and seats in the European Parliament. Hey, that's already been decided in the Lisbon Treaty. You can decide not to implement it, as has been decided, but in principle, the agreement is already there. So that's the only real thing that you need to do. I mean, the question of decision-making is, I think, a question that is connected but actually independent in many respects, to the enlargement question. It's really a question of, I mean, unanimity is never really a showstopper. Unanimity slows things down. And in a world, and this is, you know, not related to enlargement, in a world in which you can expect crisis after crisis after crisis, can you really afford to take so long to get to a decision, which eventually you reach? So I think it's a question of opportunity in a sense, rather than a question of necessity. I think the real potential problem is more in the area of policies and more in the area of, especially of the budget. I mean, you know, can you really have 7-year multi-annual financial frameworks at 35 in a world, again, I put this question of enlargement, speed and crises together, in a world in which there's crisis after crisis after crisis after crisis. A little bit cumbersome. You know, so beyond the questions that we know, whatever, agriculture, cohesion policy, but I think there's a massive budget, including decision-making on the budget question, and I don't think we're really talking about this much. Piotr's question on interdependence. Yes, I think the reason why I've lost him. I think the interdependence, the questioning of interdependence predates the war. In a sense, it starts with Trump. I mean, all of a sudden, I mean, you know, our independence rather than interdependence with the United States is weaponized against us. You know, Iran nuclear deal, extraterritorial sanctions, as well as obviously the threat of defense, you know, NATO and all the rest of it. It's there. It comes back with a vengeance with COVID, you know, which starts opening up the China question, but it's a broader issue of kind of supply chains and, oh, we shouldn't just be thinking about strategic goods as being whatever, defense and a few other things, but actually it goes all the way to masks. And then obviously the energy story in the context of the war, now the tech story in the context of China. And I think the difficulty with the EU is that the EU is kind of interdependence in the most radical form. So all of a sudden you're like, this is what you are internally, and oh shit, the rest of the world is just, you know, going in a completely different directions. Okay, some member states were like, you know, France is like, see, we were right, you know, and so you do have this push. But it's very, you're not going to change that European DNA. And so I think it's a question, I can't see, to be honest, the EU going totally protectionist. I think the point is, are we going to be able to find, in a world in which the world has changed, it's not us, the world has changed, are we going to find a new point of equilibrium that is protection without protectionism, that is going to enable us to continue being the EU, which is interdependence in most radical form, but in a world in which there are two sides to the interdependence coin. Interdependence, yeah. Peter, European, I mean, I said NATO pillar in NATO, okay, yeah. Enlargement, differentiated membership, yes, I mean, yes, but it has to end up with membership. I think, you know, all these conversations now about gradual sectoral, yes, all very good, interesting, that's exactly what we have to be doing, not just talking about it. But I think the point of this is saying, well, given the enlargement to Ukraine will take, you know, given that we're really determined to do this, will take, whatever, 8 years, not even 10, 8 years, yeah? 8 years is a long time. And what is it that we need? And I think it's connected to also the politics of this moment. I mean, this moment of opening on enlargement is not going to last forever. I mean, it's obviously contingent on the war. So to me, the question is both on the reforms, but also the reforms of the accession process. What are the goodies that can be clinched now, not as a substitute, but simply because that political moment is not necessarily going to last forever. Yeah, but yes, I know, I need to stop. But there were other questions. Okay.
Thank you so much, Nathalie, for an excellent presentation. And thank you for your great comments. Thank you for your questions. You did a bit of an enlargement at the end of the 10 minutes. But thank you very much. And yeah, let's give it up for Nathalie. And